I'll just go over the Zoom rules here. Of course, I think we've all done this enough, but if you'll please, when you're not speaking, put yourself on mute in case there's a wild dog in the back or what have you. And I'm gonna just go through some gratitudes first here. We'd like to thank our leadership here at dfac, especially for showing us the way and giving us license to continue working as we have, and for all of the resourcefulness that they've shown. So it's just incredibly important to thank them. And we'd like to thank our lead curator, Catherine Bergman, who has given me the opportunity to co-curate and independently curate alongside her and learn from her. So I'd like to thank her very much. And also like to thank Bay Art Files once again for the wonderful article that they wrote about our summer shows and a special focus on Vespertine. They're a really great art journal here in Tampa Bay. So thank you all, and thank the artists for coming today. I'm going to share the screen here. So like I said, I wanted to speak a little bit about the curatorial process. The original vision for the show was hatched about 1.5 years ago. Every fall, we change out our children's area and museum. And so I work with the youth ed director to come up with a new theme every fall. So this year we decided that mad science would be a great theme. You know, the intersection of science and art is such fertile ground, as you all know. So that's where we started. And the original vision, I think, was a little bit more extroverted. And I was thinking more of a laboratory, kind of, you know, blinking lights and I don't know, a little more colorful, I think. But when COVID hit, there was a lot of changes and difficulties, as you know, and I think my vision for this became a little bit more introspective, and was definitely a reflection of, you know, my own personal and professional thoughts and experiences through the pandemic, and then through the summer with the protests, and now the elections, and all of it together now. So I just wanted to, you know, talk about how I was guiding myself through this process with a vision of meadow meeting the edge of a forest, and using this as a metaphor for, you know, how we all learn and acquire knowledge, you know, quote unquote, the meadow. And, you know, we walk through this meadow through life, and we do come to edge of forest like we are now. And then the term Vespertine, it does mean of or relating to the evening. And so there's this vision of not only at the edge of the forest, but at the edge of a forest with the oncoming of night. And so is peering into the unknown. And I think the title, I think, was supposed to evoke a kind of a fear of the unknown, but also the courage that's required to dream our way through the dark until morning arrives. And so, you know, central to the exhibit is not only a sense of fear, but also a sense of adventure that creators and explorers of ideas and methods feel as we go through this dark wood, and the optimism for new knowledge and any kind of benefit that it will bring to all of us when we share that with other people. So I just wanted to, Catherine, our lead curator, she made these wonderful videos of all of our exhibits, and I wanted to share this with you. I wanted to share it with our guests today, so that we can just kind of give an overview of the exhibit as a whole before we get into each of your specific works. Just a moment, please. Okay, thank you for Catherine for making those videos. I hope that gives everyone, oh, Sorry about that. um, so yeah, so I hope that gives everyone kind of a broad overview of the show, and a little bit of the sound that you can hear in the gallery while you're looking at everyone's work. So now I want to go through and look at everyone's individual pieces and talk about their work with them. We're going to start with Anne Mondro. Anne is an artist and associate professor in the University of Michigan up in Ann Arbor. Good morning, Anne. How are you?
Good. How are you?
Good. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.
So I'm just going to share a little bit about you, and then we'll launch into your work. So your work has been shown nationally and internationally at some really amazing places: the Cranbrook Art Museum, Powerhouse Museum of Science and Design in Sydney. Go on and on. You're also the recipient of a National Endowment for the Arts grant for a community art program for youth and people living with dementia. I was really drawn to your work in the sense of it looking in some ways like specimen, or as you mentioned in your artist statement, religious reliquaries. And you know, I was just hoping that you could share a little bit more about, as you say in your statement, the use of metaphor as an essential element of your work. This piece was what I was really drawn to from your website, and you know, really helps me investigate the rest of your work. I just love how suggestive this piece is. And before we get into metaphor and suggestiveness and ideas, we should also note just how exquisitely crafted your work is. This glass bowl here, for those of you who can't see in person, is actually quite big. It's 14 inches high. So that straight out of the box, literally, it surprised me with its size. But I love, what I really love about this piece is the suggestiveness of the title, Attempt to Heal. Could you talk a little bit more about the metaphor that's in this piece?
Sure. So a lot of my work stems from personal experiences with working with, well, my own family experiences and dealing with the challenges that come with illness and disease, and how to process those experiences, and then working with the community. I work with people living with memory loss and their caregivers, and I've witnessed how they their journey with illness and disease, and how they have really not only have seen the struggles, but also the strengths that come in during those challenging times. Mm-hmm. And in this particular piece, it was really a piece that is about self-care and my own processing of experience, and also anxiety, and using art as a way of mindfulness practice, and using imagery of the body as a way to connect to my own physicality, as well as my emotional processing through the work. So a little bit of background.
No, perfect. And the thing that I loved about the title of this piece was Attempt to Heal doesn't quite tell us whether the healing happened or not. And so I've been wrestling with this question ever since, you know, we've put the piece in the gallery, and to me, it always reminded me a little bit of that each one of these pieces of paper in here were some kind of prayer, and that these were a collection of prayers that, you know, we had in some ways, like on our doorstop, our front door, we have a mezuzah. It's a Jewish object, or an object from Judaism, where you write a prayer and you roll it up and you put it in the mezuzah and you put it on your front door as a way to, sort of remember that prayer every day. But so in many ways, this reminded me of that. So I like the open-endedness of the title too.
Yeah, and I think with a lot of my work, processing experiences takes time. Healing is ongoing. It's not just one day you're healed. It's a process and it's a transformation. So thinking about my artwork as a way to really be introspective and reflective on where I am in that moment. It to me is part of the reason why I use that repetitiveness and repetitive act of making. So it kind of puts me into that space, that mental space, to think about where I am at this particular moment. Right. And then, of course, it takes time to make these works. So it's almost like a diary in a way, where you are kind of doing a little bit of time and revisiting it and then processing it in a different way. So that transformation occurs.
Yeah, that's great. This is the other piece that we're showing of yours in the show. And this piece is, when you see it in person, is the craftsmanship again on this is just amazing. And this brings up another aspect in your statement about referencing scientific equipment. And so this form here that's inside the glass tube is suggestive of a lot of things of the body, maybe. And oops, sorry. Let me go back. Oh boy. There we go. It's quite suggestive. The title here. So I did look up the title, and it's actually a microorganism. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Oh, it's actually baggage of the body. So it was a little bit throwing in some Latin in there to play off of the idea that it is a mix also of the scientific world as well as religious, or kind of the reliquaries, and thinking about how those worlds collide. How does spirituality and faith work within the world of science to think about healing, and especially during times of illness and disease, when you're kind of confronted with being a specimen and you're confronted with this, and how you perhaps rely on both of those worlds during that specific time in your life.
Yeah, wonderful. And I just want, this is a good touching point on, this theme runs through a lot, I think probably most or all of the artists in the show, the idea of art and science and religion coming into play as well, and intermixing, and as a way of seeking knowledge. And so in some ways, this piece in particular reminded me a little bit of the doctor's bags that doctors used to carry, like in Victorian times, or when they used to make house calls and stuff. And in some ways, I don't know if this is true or not, but it feels like in some ways, even with all the advances in knowledge that we have come, or that we have acquired since Victorian times, it feels like a little bit that there's a corollary there, where there's a lot of new knowledge that we're exploring, and a lot of old knowledge that we're kind of questioning at that we've taken for granted for a long time, and now is and in some ways it reminds me of the Victorian times when we're like, hey, leeches don't work. Stuff like that. But yeah, these are beautiful pieces, Anne. Thank you so much for sharing them with us.
Oh, thank you.
So another one of our artists here who's working with the body and ritual and sort of very meticulous, repetitive placement of material is Lisa Nelson from working up in Massachusetts. And we'll just take a time out to thank her representative Pavel Zubak, Fine Art in New York City, for sharing her work with us and working with us in so many other ways. Lisa, are you there?
Hello.
Yes, thank you. Good morning. Well, Lisa, your work has been very well received here. And before we get into ideas and concepts, I think it would be good for us to talk about your process, because I don't know if a lot of people know the history or what's happening in these pieces. So can you kind of tell us about your technique and what you're using?
It's paper. And the pieces are made of 1/4-inch strips of paper that's coiled and then pinched and shaped. And I started working with it years ago when I was transitioning from my life as an illustrator. I had a big studio and some time to experiment, and I was making mixed media pieces. I wanted to try everything. All of a sudden I wasn't restricted to the 2-dimensional life that I had been working in, and I wanted to try a different thing every day. And so I was constantly adding things to my repertoire. Actually, I have one. Can I drag in visual aids?
Yeah.
Okay, so
Yes.
Here's one of those.
Yeah, okay. Yep.
So each little block gave me an opportunity to work with a different material. And I was at a junk store, which I find much of my inspiration comes from going to junk stores and flea markets. I think it really helps hone your aesthetic sense when you see what you're attracted to. So I saw a piece of quilling in an antique store and
Wow, okay.
decided to, that was something I could add to this assemblage repertoire.
Yeah.
And so I made some little pieces. And then one of my dearest friends knows I like medical imagery, and she said, hey, Lisa, you might think this is cool. And she sent me that image, which is actually, it's a hand-colored photograph of an actual slice of a human cadaver. And it's 19th century. And just the shapes and the way that the paper responded when coiled, its sort of bounciness, its squishiness. I thought I saw a connection to that cross-section of anatomy. And then I went off on just researching what images were available in terms of anatomical cross-sections, which led me to the Visual Human Project, which is super cool. This is an image from that. And these were, it was a National Institute of Health project where cadavers were frozen and ground and photographed. So you had these very, a beautiful data set from head to toe of 2 different bodies. And it's, because it was a government sponsored project, anyone is welcome to use these images, and a lot of people have. And I tend to mix them with also looking at anatomy books and other drawn diagrams of the body, because I really like to be precise about which organ I'm actually trying to describe.
Right. Wow, they're really fascinating to look at. And many people have mentioned the fractal quality of them. And so, when Anne was speaking about the tie-in to religion and art and science, and you're doing that as well. And as I mentioned before the meeting, in my own paintings, mine are very meticulous with this kind of technique that I have, and it becomes a very meditative kind of almost ritual to make. And I've been asked before, why don't I use vinyl or some easier way to do it? And it's because, well,
Take the fun out of it.
The process is so important. I mean, the meditation that comes along with it is 75% of the point of even doing it. So could you talk to us a little bit about what kind of mind frame do you get into to not only begin making one of these, but to continue making it? And how long does it take to make one of these, by the way?
The smaller pieces took weeks. The larger ones would take maybe a month or two. I've sort of moved on from working with anatomy. I'm still working with the same quilling technique, but I'm making pieces that look something like Persian rugs. So there's a geometry to them. And the piece I'm working on now, I've been working on for 2 years. So it's a very slow process. I think that in some ways has to do with what I'm attracted to. It also has to do with, I'm not a quick decision maker. So though I'm attracted to the art making of people who are much more spontaneous, and I tend to be very methodical and very slow, and you know, I've made things like mosaics and hooked rugs and things that are just built very slowly. I just get I get a real thrill out of watching something to come together slowly.
Well, that's interesting. So the slowdown from the pandemic, did that kind of affect you at all? Or I mean, in terms of, you know, it seems like that's what you just said, that you work slowly anyway. How did it affect you?
I guess in some unexpected ways. My parents have both been sort of in and out of the hospital all summer, so that I was away from home and taking care of them.
Sorry to hear that.
Oh, away from my student, thank you. But I knew I had this big piece I've been working on to always return to. Okay. And I feel that way about my studio practice in general, that it's, I definitely have my neuroses and anxieties about my work, but when I get in a groove, it's a very safe place for me to be. And I always know I can find my way back there. So when my parents were ill, when the world was going crazy and going crazy on an ongoing basis, I feel like there's a safe place I can park myself where I feel grounded and engaged, like stimulated and relaxed at the same time, which is an ideal place to be. Yeah, yeah. So you've been able to kind of carry the flame, so to speak, through your work, and the meditative qualities of it and making it. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Anne, I wanted to come back to you. Are you there?
Yep.
Okay, sorry. I did want to also ask you, you know, what, without diminishing any hardship that you've had or any loss, have you been able to gain anything in terms of knowledge or opportunity through the summer?
I'm actually 8 months pregnant, so it's been a very different experience, and I've had to be very strict about sheltering in place, and that has brought with it, though, this just very much a slowing down and acceptance of where I am right now, and having just making sure I have pockets of time to spend on my work. And similar to Lisa, you know, I can come back to my art making, I can come back to my practice, and it's a grounding experience. So even with all that is happening with family and work and the fatigue of Zoom, having that space in my home, and kind of just finding the space, and then carving it out both physically and then again mentally, has been really important, and has brought I think brought a new awareness as to how you could create and continue to be a maker. Even when I can't go to my regular studio, you know, how can you do that at home, and how can you still have those little pockets of time for yourself? So that has been really important to practice and experience. Yeah.
Well, congratulations. That's great news. The sun will rise, won't it?
Yeah.
Also, one thing I did want to mention, that I have included every artist's website here on their kind of title page.
So if anyone wants to take another look or deeper look into all the artist's work, please do so. And especially Lisa, with you have several bodies of work that you were showing us. You have a sort of specimen pieces almost, where there's a lot of different objects and images that are put together in a case. And that was another thing I really liked about Lisa's work, especially in person, are these cases that these are displayed in. When you look at them from the side, you can see the glass is kind of wavy and they're very antique looking, and it adds a lot of meaning, you know, to the piece. So wonderful. Michael Reedy, are you with us?
Yes, I'm unmuted.
Good morning, Michael. Thank you.
Good morning.
It's great to have you here. Thanks for sharing your piece with us. I know you had a big show in New York, and
No, it was actually in Philadelphia, but
Philly.
and then a lot of my shows, you know, because of the pandemic, got moved. So now I have 2 solo shows and a 3-person show waiting for me next year. So it's going to be a massive amount of work. But yeah, so everything's sort of, you know, with how the pandemic's affected everyone, a lot of places sort of like shuffled their schedules around. So a lot of things got moved. So
we're definitely glad to have your piece here. You teach drawing up at Eastern Michigan University School of Art and Design.
Yeah, right up the road from Ann.
Do you know each other, by the way?
No, ironically, shockingly. And it's weird because as a faculty member, I've gone to a number of U of M events. We've even had some like little mixer things. And if I met Ann, it's escaped me. So it's pretty surprising.
Yeah. Well, paths cross. I just want you to talk a little bit about this piece and your work in general, and this kind of, what I really liked about this piece from all of your work was the notion of, you know, as the title suggests, 50-50, and there being this kind of balance or contrast between opposites, as you mentioned in your statement, a point of tension between hope and despair, humor and pain, living and dying. But what especially struck me in your statement was what you describe as the grand spectacle that is called getting older. So I really relate to that, having just turned 40 something in this past weekend. Could you tell us a little bit more about, you know, how you're approaching this tension, specifically talking about this piece? You know, there's a real sense of, again, meticulous exactness, but also a little bit of playfulness to it too, with the use of glitter and googly eyes. And
yeah, I mean, that piece, the piece that we're looking at, was really actually more of an experiment. I was just trying to play with some materials and playing with some ideas. It's sort of ironic that most of my work is very selfish and about me entirely. And this is actually, I'm on the other side of Ann's experience and the fact that I just had a child. And at the time I made this piece, I was trying to have a child for a long time. But one of my biggest fears was that what would they get from me? You know, it was a crapshoot. So the 50-50 was, what kind of genetic cocktail are they going to wind up with? And for me, growing up, I was always sort of mocked for my eyes, you know, called bug eyes by other kids, you know, goofy things like that. So really, the googly eyes are a manifestation of my fear that my child would get my eyes. So my initial interest in anatomy actually started maybe about 15 years ago when my brother became really sick. And I looked at all these images trying to understand what was happening to him and what he was going through physically. And the lack of pain in these images was really, it was hard to reconcile the pain that my brother was experiencing versus these images that were largely painless, I guess you could say. And then people also think, you know, when you deal with this sort of imagery, that you're interested in death, because it's often cadavers, right, and things like that we're looking at for these types of images. But all my figures are always sort of animated. They're not. I'm not really interested. Death is interesting. It's in a selfish sense that I, you know, worry about it. You know, that I cry about getting older and dying, and it's more sort of self-effacing. But I'm more interested in sort of this this sort of physical way that our bodies encounter the world, how we persevere as physical things, and sort of this constant pain, just physically and emotionally, of just sort of existing. So, you know, I try to contrast this sort of like bleak, hyper sensitive way I negotiate my relationships with people and getting older, with this, at least some degree of self-awareness that I am being self-obsessed, you know, that I'm kind of being a sad sack about it. Somebody told me once that I was a mixture between Eeyore and Charlie Brown, and I've never forgot that. I think that I kind of am. So my drawings are some way to find humor in that reality.
I was going to ask you about that. You mentioned, you know, I think all of us have had to definitely, you know, step on the pedal with perseverance this summer, especially. But you know, keeping how do we find humor in our situation, or how do we find some goodness in our situation? And, you know, you mentioned, you know, all your shows got shifted and a bunch of stuff changed, and are you teaching virtually too, online and all of that? Or,
yeah.
You know, what kind of, what good has come out of any of this for you in terms of knowledge or opportunity?
Oh, I don't know. My teaching is such an abstract thing relative to my making, in a sense. I mean, like, you know, you're trying, I guess, as when you're a teacher, you're trying to, you know, coach people to find themselves. So it's a whole different sort of thing, you know, in terms of like those experiences and how they impact what I do. I mean, I was teaching over the summer as a guinea pig, you know. Eastern opened its campus to in-class teaching over the summer, and I was one of, I think, 5 people in there teaching over the summer. So that was an experience. You know, so we got to do the social distancing model in real life to see how well it would work and if any of us would get sick. So it was pretty intense. But I mean, most of the time, you know, I don't know how to I guess I'm just lacking in words of how to explain how I think about things. But
in slowing down, or, you know, being forced to slow down a little bit, or, you know, if your shows have been moved, did it give you any space to, you know, be with family more, or anything like that? I know
in fact, you know, I recently sort of removed myself from social media. I've had a real reckoning in my studio, actually, a real, I think, because so much of my work for so long was about this sort of sense of loss and sort of this pursuit of children and what that idea meant to me. And, you know, my parents, you know, getting quite old, the loss of my grandfather last year, all of these sort of things have, I don't know, it's really strange, because I've been working on this piece and I boxed it up and I stopped working on it, and I sort of shut down and I've taken a really strange break, and it's the first time. And I've known artists who have like disappeared and stopped making work. And I always thought, you know, what happened to them? You know, what happened to them? And I couldn't understand what happened to them, because I thought they made great work and I respected them. And I said, well, you know, whatever happened to them? And oddly, I'm that person right now where I'm looking at myself and I'm like, what happened to me? You know,
Yeah.
but, you know, I think the fact that I'm dealing with a child that has a lot of very specific needs, the fact that some of the things that I was trying to cope with through sort of humor and displacement, this all of a sudden became not so funny to me. I don't know. I was making this piece. It was really strange about like this idea of like dying in the soul, this like vomit goes floating up into this death vortex. And then I was like, where does this death vortex lead? And then I realized, well, it just probably leads to another death vortex. So I started making this drawing of this figure sort of like puking itself into this endless spiral of vortexes. And I thought, well, this is interesting, you know, and this is horrible and painful and sad, but kind of funny. And then I added all these horrified figures and cherubs sort of, you know, helping the soul transcend into this never-ending spiral of death vortexes. And then at some point, though, it just, I don't know what happened. You know, I just sort of hit a wall on it, and it's sitting right there in a box on a shelf. And since then, I've just been sketching and trying to figure my way back out of what I'm doing. You know, because and it's even weird participating in this conversation. I probably just rambled on about a bunch of nonsense to people, but because a lot of you are fellow artists, maybe you understand or empathize with how it is to sort of.
Yeah, I think we do, and I think the notion of being given that space to, you know, reevaluate or really think about what one is doing or dealing with, you know, is really important. And so I know, you know, that's been, if there was one flashpoint for me this whole time, it was that space to slow down and think. So I have enjoyed that.
Yeah, see, I wish I was you, because my problem is that I haven't been able to think. I think it was like this this screeching, like hit a wall, you know, sort of not being able to think myself out of the problem I was in. You know?
Yeah, well, I don't want to.
Yeah, so it's really it's I don't know. It's one of those things where I guess I'm going to have a lot to, you know, help my students with in the future when I figure out how to get past it. Because when I have students telling me, you know, I don't know where to go next, I'll be like, well, trust me, you know,
that's right.
We've all been there. But
yeah. Well, thanks a lot, Michael, for sharing all that. That's and, you know, best of luck with everything.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'm excited. I mean, I'm hoping like looking at all this wonderful stuff and hearing other people talk will, you know, relight some fires for me.
Yeah, definitely.
So,
yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. McArthur, are you with us?
Yes, right here.
Good morning, McArthur. How are you today?
Good morning. I'm doing well.
Excellent. McArthur, you live here in Tampa, and so I followed your work for quite a while and was so happy to meet you in person when you delivered your work. So tell us a little bit about yourself. You teach now at the University of Florida, South Florida.
Yes. Yeah, I've been at the University of South Florida for about 8 years now. I teach animation and digital modeling.
Okay.
I'm an associate professor there. I guess one of the things about me is I have a background. Actually, a lot of the works that I'm creating now are sculptural, but I have a background in drawing and painting. That's really kind of where I started out. Mm-hmm. And over the last, well, it's been a while now, but over the last few years, and which probably means like 10, I don't know, but I've been moving much more towards sculptural works. And a lot of that has been through digital means and 3D printing. And sort of physical materials are sort of second to that. So I had basically been working digitally most of that time, and I've been creating physical works from those.
That's kind of where I wanted to start conversation with you today. Is I think when people have come to see your work it's been helpful for me to be there to let them know a little bit about your process, because it's pretty new what you're doing. Could you lead us through that? Like, I mean, you're creating these works initially in a digital realm, a digital sculpting, which is really fascinating to me. So could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, there are, I mean, I guess there are a lot of ways that you can create three-dimensional objects on the computer. But one of the ways that I use most commonly, I guess I just call it digital sculpting. I might have to change that name somehow, but like digital sculpting, not that I may come up with, it's common, but digital sculpting, which is usually really high resolution sculpting. You're working with polygons, but it's such a great number that it starts to smooth out the surface. It's kind of like working with clay. To me, it has a really tactile quality to it. I can kind of push, pull, and carve and shape forms. And the reason
Sorry, McArthur, sorry to interrupt, but just to be clear, you're doing this with a VR, a virtual reality set and special gloves, or how are you?
So both, and that was why I was saying maybe I might need to stop. I might have to change from saying just digital sculpting because I call that VR sculpting, but it's still digital sculpting.
Okay.
But most of my works are sculpted using a tablet, and a tablet where I'm kind of pushing and pulling forms that way. But I also do several works where I'm actually working in VR. Which is a little bit different. It feels different, but it's a really exciting way of working. And that way, it's really like the form is there with you. You can walk around it. You can lift it up. You can scale it down to size. And I think that's a really exciting way to work too. The process is different. It feels different, but I think really both are interesting. These are sculpted using like a tablet and software, like rather than in VR, the ones in the show.
Okay. Yeah, so I think in some ways it's a really interesting hybrid, almost between you're working on a two-dimensional surface, but you're sculpting three-dimensionally, and then you're able to print it three-dimensionally from a file, and then you're able to use that print as to make molds for bronze, which is a very traditional medium.
Mm-hmm.
So you're really combining a lot of different ways of making, which is really exciting to me.
Yeah. Okay.
Go ahead. Yep.
No, I mean, it's exciting to me to kind of deal. I mean, I think I kind of deal with the forms in a very traditional way as well, like clay. But then sometimes I actually go back and forth. But I've gone back and forth between clay and digital by scanning and continuing to work that way too.
Okay. Yeah. Wow. And then I think we talked about this a little bit when you delivered the work. These works that you brought us are quite small.
Yep.
They fit in the palm of our hands. But you are able to make quite large works with the same method, but you have to work in pieces and put them together, or how does that work?
Yeah. So these works, I think if I have to think about it, several of these pieces were printed out on my printer. And even those I would have to print in half just to get up to 9 inches. So the build size is fairly small to be able to build something in, but I can actually build it in pieces and then assemble it. So like, for instance, that piece would have been cut in half. But that's still fairly small. So one of the things that I've started to do, I still 3D print, but I use a CNC router to be able to create much larger pieces. So the CNC router is basically like a sister technology to 3D printing, where rather than building up the surface in layers, it carves away from a block of material. And then I do build it in pieces just to be able to create much larger pieces. Like I did a public art project recently that is built in pieces like that. Wow.
And you're teaching the next generation how to do all this.
Well, most of my students are sort of centered in animation and digital sculpting, thinking about like film and games and that type of thing. But but every now and then I do have some sculpture students or other students who are interested in fabricating, or some of those students have done 3D printing and scanning since then. Yeah.
Well, so beyond the technology aspect of this, what really drew me to your work was the kind of the notion of malleability. And as we apply malleability to things like knowledge or identity, and this sort of, I don't know how to explain it exactly without closing my eyes and kind of squishing my fingers together, to kind of shape and reshape things as we need them to be. So you mentioned a little bit, conceptually in your work that you are dealing with identity and moldability and hybridization as it applies to identity and knowledge and things like that. What kind of understanding have you come to through your process about, how we construct, the story of our lives?
It's interesting. So I guess the jumping off part for me creating these works really had to do with adapting to social situations, particularly Black people having to adapt to certain social situations, and the idea that our identities have often been constructed for us or presented in certain ways, and without us necessarily being able to have authorship. And that whether in some cases monsterized, sexualized, but then there's also as often having to defend our intelligence or our capacity for pain, and all these all of these assumptions that become added on to us as our identity. So I think in a lot of the works that I was in several of these works, this group of works, Strange Figurations, has to do with trying to adapt in all of these different social situations, and for survival, for getting a job, for being socially accepted, and how in doing that you can overcompensate in some ways, or suppress or ignore, to where you actually make distortions of yourself in some ways. So so each one is in some ways it's about these sort of modifications to one's identity. So I think of them as bodies. They're not specific to like they don't look like figures in a traditional sense, but these sort of distortions and modifications of bodies. And originally, I should say this, I guess there were figures that had appendages on them, or costumes that they added on to their bodies to try to adapt. And eventually I just sort of simplified it down to where they became these forms.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, that's really fascinating. I do love, have a special place in my heart for abstraction that is also narrative, that can carry a story. So I really love your work. I love the technique and the technology. Thanks for sharing that.
Thank you.
What have you kind of gained any goodness out of this summer, or gained any new knowledge or anything? It's been a tough summer.
It has, there's been an intersection of several things this summer, still ongoing. But I'm on sabbatical this year, so one of my goals was to kind of have this sort of ultra learning time originally, I guess, like before all of this, and that hasn't gone so easily. I also have 2 kids, I'm homeschooling, that kind of thing. But what has come out of it is I think is how much people are sharing online, and how people are connecting in that way. I think on one hand, an analogy would be like, even in terms of family, right? Before, people who you might not connect with, I may talk to my mom every day now. Wow. In video chat or something. So, but then there are artists sharing in the same way. I'm trying to carve out that time to learn new processes, which was my goal. And I've always wanted this sort of pattern or repetition. And I think this is sort of forced that. I'm in extreme social distancing. So we are here all the time, every day. So it's allowing that, but it's still trying to carve out that time. It's with regardless with 2 kids, because they are not distant. So now that they're home, that adds a whole nother dynamic to it. So.
Yeah. I hear you. Yeah, it's been challenging. And I like that you brought up, that your hand was forced to do something, and I relate to that very strongly. I was in the same position and was forced to do something that I had been meaning to do for a long time and hadn't, and just because there was a lot of unknowns, and the time was now. So, wow, thanks for sharing, McArthur. Great work.
Thank you.
Great talking to you.
You too.
Elizabeth A. Baker, are you with us?
Yes.
Good morning. How are you?
I'm fine. Thank you for asking.
Thank you so much for joining us today. Elizabeth, we've known each other for a couple of years now. You're in St. Petersburg. And there's a lot to talk about with your work, but you are known for the way that you shape a space with music. And I really love the idea of sculpting space with music and sound, and create an experience for an audience. You also happen to be a filmmaker, and your work was included in the African Smartphone International Film Festival, which is amazing, in Nigeria. You have a solo album called Quadrivium. Am I saying that right? I'm sorry. Okay.
Yes.
Which is exceptional. I've listened to it. It's really wonderful. And you've been the recipient of a number of awards and grants, including the individual artist grant from the state of Florida. This video that you have in the show, I found really, really beautiful. And what I wanted to talk to you a little bit about today, after I share the video, is this move into, the meadow or the forest, as opposed to where you're normally working in the studio or in front of an audience. So let's watch your video first, and then we'll talk. Wow. Thank you, Elizabeth. I love that piece. It's so amazing. And the way that it washes through the gallery is so beautiful, and how it touches all of the other pieces within the gallery and really helps create a tone for the whole show. So thanks for sharing your work with us. Do you want to talk about your field studies project a little bit?
Sure. So field studies is, oh, I should also say that was all shot on an iPhone, because that's my favorite thing to like reveal to people. It's like, yeah, your iPhone can do that. So with field studies, it's basically a project where I want to achieve multiple things. The first thing is I want to prove that Florida is more than just Florida man, and that we have an incredibly biodiverse ecosystem. A lot of that video was shot on the side of the highway. So yeah, I mean, and then the second thing is more sort of like this meta thing. I don't really try to tell people what to think about my work, but I wanted to create works where narrative that was human-centric was not the center of the idea. So I go into these spaces and it's not like I'm going to perform outside. It's I'm going to go into a space, honor the space and the objects and entities within that space, and we're going to be co-collaborators on this piece. And so that's basically the idea behind it. I think that once people start to stop dealing in human-centered narrative, it becomes way easier to be empathetic and understanding that all objects, not just like birds and living things that we think about, but like I'm the person that gets triggered by people that like stab their plate at dinner. I'm like, oh, that's violent. That hurts. And so I really just want to help create a world, or at least help open a dialogue where we talk about the feelings and needs of other things that don't have to do with how they relate to humans.
Yeah, that's, and there's a, I think that's a kind of a zeitgeist that's happening in culture wide right now, where there's this kind of movement towards, like you said, outside the self. How do we work with our environment? It's so critical now to start thinking about that. We have a couple of other artists in the show who are exploring that idea too, and the collaboration with nature. And so, yeah, it was just the field studies were, I thought, a really interesting move for you, because what I've known from you before was much studio based and audience based, and I thought it was interesting that you would be audience less out in nature, unless the birds are listening, of course. But
they're participating.
Participating, yeah. So yeah, interesting notion.
It actually isn't a departure for me. This is stuff that I'd been doing for years. I just hadn't either publicly made it known as a forefront thing. So there's field recordings all over my past work. It's just, I haven't been like, hey guys, this is a field recording. It's more like,
okay.
It's there, but it's not the forefront of the attention. Whereas these field studies are just stripped bare. What can we do in the space with minimal assistance?
Gotcha. Huh. And that instrument that you had in the video, this sort of triangular conical looking instrument that you were playing with a bow.
It's called a waterphone. Yeah.
Okay, so that's did you make that yourself, or?
No.
Okay.
I would have loved to make it myself, because the waterphone was invented by a man who had the last name Water. It's water goes in it and bends the pitch, but it got the name Water because the guy who invented it, his last name is Water. Oh, okay. But if I had invented it, or if I were building one, there are some design elements that I would fix. Like it needs to, that cylindrical situation needs to have sort of a flute to it so that the water can actually exit the water phone in a way that you don't have to shake weight it in order to get as much water out so that it doesn't sit in that pan.
Yeah.
But no, I didn't build it.
Okay. How have you managed this summer? Have you has it been, you know, some hardship and loss, and anything good happened for you?
I'm pretty pandemic like fit because I tour as a solo artist for most of my year. And I am not home. And when I am home, I'm completely isolated because I've become so weird from touring that I don't know how to integrate into regular society. So with that being said, pandemic isolation, super easy. The secondary pandemic that Black artists and Black people have had to deal with, that has been very difficult because all of a sudden my time to work is being interrupted constantly, either by well-meaning friends or misrepresentation, or because there's an uptick of work because now everyone all of a sudden that didn't want to look at you before wants your work. And so you're constantly in a state of flux. And then the third, like, I don't know, I think we're at 4 or 5, I don't know, lots of numbers. The next one was that in our specific area, there are an increase of hate graffiti. The mayor has not said things or done things that make you as a Black person feel that you matter, so you feel unsafe. We've even had, I'm gonna call them domestic terrorists because that's what they are, with guns outside of polling locations. And so for me, I mean, I'll be very candid, I had a full breakdown quite recently because it's so much trauma being triggered at one point in time that no sane human could probably like just push through it and be okay. So for me, the pandemic that's the most problematic is not even the virus one. It's the one that's the pandemic of hate and ignorance.
Yeah, no, this, I think that has been very, very difficult. The ever widening gap between, you know, people and ideas, and then the pandemic just with social isolation makes it even more so. And then we all revert to, you know, media, which doesn't help. So I think that's what has been in many ways beneficial about having this space and having this space open for people to come in again and experience, you know, because art is so good, or can be good, at sharing and communicating and showing where we cross paths rather than where we differ. So, you know, as much of the inspiration for this show was about the intersection of art and science and, you know, spirituality, it's also about our relationships to each other. So just, again, want to thank you all for participating and sharing through this time. And I hope, Elizabeth, we might be able to see you here before the show closes. But if not, I understand. Do you have any projects you're working on that you want us to know about?
So many. I'm finally doing a live concert. I hate live streaming. I'm fundamentally against it because most musicians only care about documentary style. Like, and I'm like, no, there's all this visual aspect, and the visual world is rich, and you need to like think about that if you're gonna do like maybe involve a visual artist. I don't know. So finally going to be doing a telematic performance using this very fancy pure data patch by Miller Pluckett called Netty McNetface, which allows you to control the latency on each channel that's coming in from each artist with the Wexler Center through the Ohio State University New Music Ensemble. So I'll be their guest artist performing with them And all of the artist members are actually in different places. One of them is even in Colombia.
Wow.
So it will be a very exciting thing. And then other than that, I'm doing sound films. I'm playing with rice bowls in my parents' bathtub, which they love. And then posting those online because it's difficult to do field studies now because we're just coming out of our rainy season and a lot of stuff is flooded. And I don't do water moccasins. So,
right. Yeah.
Yeah.
For those of us not connected to you, how can we be informed of that performance that you just talked about at the Wexler?
It will probably be up on the Ohio State website at some point in time. Also, Googling my name generally brings a lot of things up.
All right. We'll Google you. Well, thanks a lot, Elizabeth. We really appreciate your work and your attendance today.
Thank you.
Thanks for sharing. Kaisa, are you with us?
Hello.
Hi, good morning.
Good
Or
morning.
Is it
Yes,
still morning where you are?
It's
Yeah.
definitely morning.
Okay. Kaisa, you're in LA, right?
Yes.
Okay, so on the other side of the country. Oops. Dang it. Sorry, let me get to you.
Yeah, no worries.
There you are. Okay. There's your website, kaisajohnson.com. We are showing a couple of pieces. Let me get you here from your Long Goodbye series, but you do have several other bodies of work. So I encourage people to go visit your website and look at all of the things that you're doing. So Kaisa, you graduated from the Glasgow School of Art in Scotland.
Yeah.
Yeah, how did that transpire?
Oh my gosh. I started off as a fine art major at Skidmore College, and I grew up having a lot of friends that lived in the UK. I don't know why, but I did. And I used to travel there to visit them. And when I wanted to do my year abroad, I decided to go there. And I kind of applied to the Glasgow School of Art, not necessarily understanding the full weight of that, I guess. And then I arrived and I kind of went from skating through my courses really easily to being like the worst person in the class. Which was fantastic. Like it truly stretched me and challenged me and pushed me in a way that I wouldn't have been. So I decided to transfer. And when I did my, when I went in for my year abroad, the system there is much different. You specialize much earlier and it becomes much more intense much earlier. So it's more like a master's program. So when I went in, I went from being in my third year at undergrad to like a second year in Glasgow. So I spent my final 3 years in Glasgow. I transferred over, and that was like the best thing that could have happened because it's a school that really focuses on sort of ideas and aesthetics intertwining. And that really is how I function best. I didn't know that at the time. But yeah, it was, I didn't want to leave. I actually got deported. So I loved Scotland.
Well, nothing lasts forever, I guess.
Yeah, exactly, which is the whole point.
Yeah, yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit about your work here. The pieces that we have here, like I said, from this series, The Long Goodbye. And I'm always a big fan of this kind of complex layering of symbols or, just compositional elements. I really like that. There's a lot of interesting mark making that's happening in your pieces that to me, sometimes they refer to mathematical symbols somehow. And
They are, yeah.
Yeah. So, but what I wanted to ask you about, your titles are so specific, right? So here we have the creation of hydrocarbons in the Death Eater Nebula, Right. And so I wanted to ask you, are you actually looking at specific data and specific photographs, and then
Yeah.
clearly you're not copying them? So
I mean,
how do you?
I think I am, I guess.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I mean, well, it's funny because, you know, I know that especially this series, I always think of myself as a representational artist because I'm, so there's an alphabet to each of the series that I make. Often the alphabet is particle decay patterns, which are the signature pathways that subatomic particles that are unstable travel along through time and space as they decay into more stable particles. So there's about 11 of these patterns that have become my alphabet that I often use to build up other imagery that relates to them conceptually. So when you're saying you feel like they are like mathematical, I'm glad that you feel that way, because they are. And so that's why I've notated them, because I want there to be an understanding that these relate to imagery that is available to us, that is real, but it's available to us through science. Mm-hmm. And then the compositions for the series are based on Hubble Space Telescope photographs of different celestial events or bodies. So the specific idea in this series is to take these particle decay patterns, which are sort of this fundamental expression of change and dissolution and transformation and, you know, the complexity, the good and the bad that comes with that, but it's a constant, right, in everything in the universe. Mm-hmm. And then pair it with the large version of that, which is, you know, the birth and death of stars. And so with the previous one, so all of my work is titled, and sometimes they become ridiculously long. Oh, I I'm just naming what it is, because to me it's so obvious that it's like particle decay patterns and like a rapidly spinning neutron star, but you know, only because I've been staring at that imagery for so long.
Right. Somebody who had no knowledge of, or hadn't been exposed to, you know, astrophysics or quantum physics or anything like that would not necessarily make that connection. But there is, I think, the ubiquity of the spiral, you know, shape is very relatable to people. So there's that kind of connectivity, I think, right away. You know, you get that you're in this spiral, this sense of spiraling. And then, like you said, those symbols there do offer you a doorway into some understanding that there's something else going on here. You know, and then I just wanted to ask you, there's no right or wrong to this, of course. And I grapple with this question a lot because I'm inspired by fractals and chaos theory myself. And I'm really drawn to those big pattern connections, you know, between, like I said, the spiral, for example, is, you know, goes all the way from subatomic all the way up to galaxies and who knows where else. And I wanted to ask you what you thought about, is there necessarily a connection between things that share a pattern or a shape?
Yeah, I would say yes. I mean, I would say there's a connection between everything, and that is sort of why I do the work that I do, I guess, is trying to tease out those connections. I feel like there's always a connection, even if it's just that there's particle decay patterns like running through everything. Like there's fundamental connections. And then there's really specific connections that maybe, I guess I think about it in terms of like strings and ropes, and the connection can be like a small string, or it can be like a big rope. Mm-hmm. But my interest is in teasing out those connections over physical scale, and then also like through time. So I'm really interested in how either conceptual patterns or like historical patterns repeat. You know, for us to be aware of them so that we can feel more connected and maybe zoom out and zoom in and just get a broader sense of connectivity to both our physicality, and then also our like temporality. Yeah. So yes, everything. I think everything. I mean, everything is in some way. Like we're all made of the same stuff. It's just in different configurations.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. And that's such, it seems like an obvious kind of story, but it's just so important to tell that story over and over and over and over again, especially in the summer, where we just have, so we were talking with Elizabeth about, the division and the hate, the, if we try to see things in perspective, and we just hope that would help. And so what else we can share these stories. And so we're glad to have this work in the show, because it does speak to that, connectivity between the individual and the general, or the big and the small. So thanks a lot for this beautiful work. What you mentioned, I think you had to step away actually. To like many of us, work with your children, online learning and things like that. What good has any good come out of all of this for you?
I mean, yeah, I think, I moved my studio home into the garage, which initially I was like sad, but now it's a shift, of course.
Yeah.
But, I think I had a dream actually the other night that the kids went back to school. I have a 10-year-old and a 6-year-old. And I was really sad. I was like missed. No, but that's what I would have thought, is that I was like, woohoo, like I have hours on end to work again.
Right.
But there's been something about that kind of deep connection of like, the world has become very, very small. And that has been, I don't know, I'm living in a space of like 3-day sections. I feel like I'm just sort of shifting through time, and there seems to be no sense of future, but a deep sense of past, and like that is how it is, and that's sort of fine and meditative. I think I've wanted to work on animations for years and years and years.
Oh yeah.
And so when I moved out of my studio, I took that money and invested in, technology, and have started doing that, which has been really fulfilling. And, someone else was talking about like, it's something being just like thrust upon you, and now is the time. And it was like, oh, well, I'm losing this, but I can gain this. And
yeah.
So, and I had a kind of busy year before, and then I have like not even anything that got moved, and that's sort of fun. I don't know, I feel weird, like in a way, like Michael's talking about, like I feel like I'm in a space that might cause anxiety, and it's not, and that's what's causing me anxiety, but it's fine. I don't know. Does that make any sense?
No, I hear you. Yeah, I think I was thinking about this on the way in this morning about, really looking in retrospect, looking back. I still have a job. No one in my family has suffered. We've gone through similar hardships as other people in the beginning, especially. We didn't know if my wife would have a job, all of this, and then the online learning. But in the end, I have to be very grateful for everything that we still have. And so I do, but there's still a general anxiety there, I think, and that's just not going to go away, I don't think. So it's coming up with these new ways of thinking about things, and shifting ideas, or shifting feelings, and shifting expectations.
Yeah.
And sort of living in that space that's been created, and being okay with that for a while. So yeah, I think we all get it. Mm-hmm.
And connecting with other artists, like I'm part of a group called Artists for Democracy, and we've been doing a lot of like get out the vote talks and things like that. And initially we wanted to send people to art schools in swing states to talk in person, and we couldn't, but then we were able to open up this program to this like broad swath of schools and students, and that pivot created a lot more connectivity, that you know, has been, yeah, there's a different kind of connection, but almost this like broader web of connection. That's actually been very fulfilling, I think.
Oh, that's great. So you've actually got quite a bit going on that keeps you busy and out of the bar, so to speak.
Well, yeah, I think that has actually been the thing that's relieved my anxiety, is feeling like I'm with a group of people working towards this like bigger goal. So maybe
yeah,
that, you know.
Yeah. Yep. Well, thank you, Kaisa. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Julia, are you with us?
I am.
Oh, good morning. Thank you so much for joining us today. I wanted to mention that you have an event coming up here at Dunedin, a virtual event, of course. It's a coffee and conversation. It's put on by a group here called the Sterling Society. They're big supporters, and there's several founders of the Art Center in the group. So we'll look forward to that event on November 10th at 12 p.m. And all of the information for that is on the Dunedin Fine Arts Center webpage, dfac.org, under events. So you're going to be talking about your larger practice during that talk. So today we're going to focus on this specific work that we have in the show, which is, I think, a really fascinating piece in general, but specifically as an artist. You know, how we're all taught how to develop a composition so that the eye covers the whole composition, right? And so this piece really illustrates how people look at a piece of art. So before we get into that, I just want to talk about, or let you talk about your background a little bit, specifically your background in neuroscience and your Sci-Art initiative.
Yeah, absolutely. So I, like many artists, I don't really remember when I started to be an artist. It was just always a part of my life. But it was when I was in college, exploring different artistic mediums, that I also started to explore other academic interests. And I discovered neuroscience, the science of the brain, and fell in love immediately. The mental life was something I was always really interested in, but up until that point, it had been from the angles of like psychology and mental illness, but I hadn't encountered the hard science of the brain before I was a freshman in college. And something really clicked for me. As a visual artist, I'm a very tactile person. I make physical things in the world. And so thinking about the brain's physicality and everything from the cellular level to the molecular level, it's just something that really resonated with me and ended up pretty quickly inspiring me to make art exclusively about neuroscience and the brain in general. So it's not always obvious how neuroscience is present in my work at first glance, but it's always there somewhere.
Okay. Well, let's get into this piece a little bit, and I think we'll need to explain it a little bit. That this is drawn from a project where you're using I'm just going to read this: eye tracking data from A.L. Yarbus, who is the scientist who conducted this project. And he asked his subjects a series of questions and tracked how they looked at this painting by Ilya Repin, who's a pretty famous Russian painter. And I think that these questions are really interesting. You know, they're not like find the person with the black dress. It's, you know, for this one, for example, estimate how long the unexpected visitor had been away from the family. And that's sort of like open-ended, because you're having to look at the expression on people's faces and their body language rather than just purely, you know, aesthetic clues. So did you had access to the actual data, or how did you make
Yeah, so I collect data, I collect research papers, and I don't always know what I'm going to do with them, but I usually am attracted to data because of its aesthetics and because of what's behind it as well. And so I've happened upon this paper when I was researching eye tracking, which is one scientific tool that is used to figure out where people attend to in a specific visual scene. What are humans interested in looking at? Primarily, we're interested in looking at faces. If a face is available in your visual scene, you will look at it so quickly without thinking about, I'm going to look at this face.
Okay.
Why is that? It's probably evolutionary in basis. It's really important for humans to know where other humans are, whether they're your friends or they're not your friends. So A.L. Yarbus was a scientist in the 1970s who did this study to understand where people looked in paintings. And if you overlay, so I did a series of 7 drawings based on his data. I enlarged the data and I emphasized some aspects of the data, but they really are true to the data themselves. And if you overlay the data on the painting, which he used as the stimulus in his scientific study, you'll see that the clusters of lines where it gets really dense and blob-like is roughly where people's faces are in this painting. So yeah, this one is give the ages of the people. So you can kind of see that top leftmost dense blob is the man, the visitor who's coming in, and whereas the far 2 right ones are the children on the right side of the painting. And for me, I was interested in the data. The painting is, he chose it as his study subject. Maybe it was his favorite painting. I have no idea why he chose this particular painting, although it was a relief that we weren't just looking at another study about the Mona Lisa or something that's really been studied to death in terms of the neuroaesthetic community. But for me, the data really captured me because you could call them squiggles, you could call them just like random drawings. You know, if you didn't have context, they might just look like somebody doodling. However, I think they look like a little bit more than that. I think they look purposeful. I think they have embedded meaning within them because they are these eye tracking data. So I found kind of beauty within them just on their own, unrelated to the painting, and the idea that within just the data themselves, there is this sort of representation of the painting itself and kind of the relationship between a physical object, looking at it, how the brain processes it, how the eye moves around it. So it's like a version of the painting, as it were.
Yeah. I thought, yeah, I think you're completely right about the context. And, you know, we have shared to the side of the installation here an image of the painting so that and the questions here in a map so that people can put 2 and 2 together while they're looking at this. And that context is really important. The drawings are beautiful in themselves, and just the line quality and the kind of searching that's happening in them, I really like that. But then when you add this context to it, you know, it, especially for all of our students here at the Art Center, I think it was really, you know, interesting to see that there's more than one way to look at a picture, and it depends on the questions that you're bringing to it. So, you know, I'm going to see something different than you are in any painting I look at because I'm bringing a different question to it. And but I wanted to ask you something else about something you said in your statement about, I'm just going to read what you said here, that your goal as a science-based artist is to provide my viewer with an alternative way to understand the wonders of biology we have discovered in ourselves. And so I think this is a kind of theme that runs through everyone's work in the show, is that although we're using science as a launching pad, there's some sort of transformation that either occurs naturally or that we want for it to happen, so that it becomes a broader kind of understanding than just, you know, knowing what the data is or the facts of the thing. So why do you think it's important that we have those alternative ways to understand?
Well, for me, when I started to study and continue to, because as you mentioned earlier, science is not a fixed thing. We re-examine old findings. We have new findings. We have mixes thereof. So there's always something going on, especially in neuroscience, which is a very new science, relatively and historically speaking. But when I started to learn about neuroscience, I had a newfound and continue to have a newfound appreciation for my own biology. And I started to understand myself on the level of, you know, G protein coupled receptors, which are embedded within the cellular surface. For me, because I am the way that I am, I find that particularly interesting. I find it comforting. I find it mysterious. I find it inspiring. And for people who enjoy looking at my work, they usually find some sort of similar avenue into their own brains, understanding, not with this particular piece, but other works that I make that are more, you know, reference cellular structures, like, oh, wow, that's like a little bit of me, how beautiful and interesting it is. We don't have access to our own biology. Very few people in the world have access to the brain under a microscope, right? And so through my art, I try to give people a way to access. Art's a visual and universal language, and it, you know, anyone can come to it and have their own experience, and will, because of what they're bringing to the table as well. And so I leave my pieces, you know, as open as possible for that reason. There's always a message, but it's never, I never dictate. And so, yeah, I hope to inspire other people to think about themselves in a more biological way, because for me, it's been really a life gift. It's really enriched my life. And unfortunately, most people only experience biology in their high school biology class, which personally, I slept through most of. It was not inspiring. It was the least interesting thing as a teenager. But, you know, when you're an adult, you can kind of return to these things which maybe you missed or didn't decide to pursue, but have a different perspective on them.
Yeah, yeah. Just quickly before we talk to Luke Myers, you mentioned before we got the meeting started that through the course of the year, a lot of your exhibitions got shifted and or turned into virtual exhibitions, and that this ended up being the only physical exhibit this year. And for me, that was a good thing to hear, that we, you know, in a sense, we made the right choice to continue with physical exhibits, because it's so important to see art in person if you can. Is there anything else that good that has come out of this summer for you?
Yeah, you know, I think like for everybody, there have been hard aspects of the past 7 months or so. I have been busier than ever. You mentioned my organization, SciArt Initiative. It's a nonprofit that I run and founded 6 years ago, dedicated to bridging the gulf between the arts and sciences. And so while I'm an artist at heart, I really am so passionate about organizing events for artists and bringing together communities around the arts with the concepts of science embedded within our programming. So when COVID hit, a lot of our exhibits got pushed and a lot of our programming had to be altered. And so I was immediately inspired to just launch a set and series of really robust virtual programs, because the arts are more important now than ever. It's easy to feel like they're not important because they're not saving people's lives. They're not, doing things which might have a real impact for a lot of people on a very day-to-day basis. However, everyone kind of knows, if you're a lover of the arts, that engaging with the arts is so beneficial to mental health and emotional health. And now that we're all stuck on our computers at home, why not engage with the arts online in the best ways that we can through events like this. So I started to, do a lot of online events and just figure out, what works on these platforms, what doesn't work, and actually our audience has just increased by so much because people can attend from all over the world. And that is amazing. And like many other organizations, we're going to continue virtual programming forever now, not exclusively, but the fact that we're able to have more of a global dialogue and not be so United States centric has been really, really wonderful and amazing. And it's because platforms like Zoom have become acceptable all of a sudden. They're not weird, people know how to use them. And so it just opened up this new door. And that's been our huge silver lining, for me on a personal level and on an organizational level.
Wow, so, that's really good news. That kind of feeling of expansion, it feels so good in a time like this. So congratulations. If we go to your website here, does that link to SciArt Initiative or how?
It does, yeah, it links out through a tab, and you can also go to sciartinitiative.org. Or okay. Google us, you'll find us pretty easily. But yeah, all of our events are free and open to the public. So I hope to see some of you there at some point.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Julia. We'll look forward to hearing more from you in November.
Yes, thanks, Nathan.
Luke, are you with us?
Hey, how's it going?
Good, how are you, Luke?
Good.
Good, thanks for joining us. A little bit of background on Luke. Luke is pursuing his master's at University of South Florida. I presume you know McArthur? Good.
Yeah, we worked together.
Yeah.
A little bit. Yeah.
And I'm going to read a little bit from your statement here. Luke spends times with bugs, learning about them and sharing space with them. He then translates those experiences into sculpture, video, and social action in order to question the hierarchies that currently define the Gaia-Anthropos relationship. There's a lot in that. But I just wanted to let you know that I love this piece for a lot of reasons, and mainly for the reverence that it shows or displays for this kind of little creature. I think Elizabeth A. Baker touched on it a little bit about, being in the environment and collaborating with nature rather than being the other. So let's get into your piece here. Tell us more about this project, Learning to be a Scarab.
Well, it started when I first moved to Florida to attend USF. There's a community of these particular deep digger scarab beetles that lives on campus. And that's evident because in around like the end of December, beginning of January, those little piles start to appear like in the field where they live. That's them like excavating their burrows. So, I was driving to campus every day and being like, what are these particular sand piles? Like I know what like a gopher tortoise or a pocket gopher makes for a hole, but like these things are like appearing and then it rains and then they're gone and they appear again like seemingly overnight. So I just wanted to know what that was. And then I found out what the species was, and then I found out that like despite their them being endemic to Central Florida, meaning that they don't live anywhere else besides like specific like deep sand xeric habitats in Central Florida. And the University of Florida at Gainesville having the greatest entomology department in the country, supposedly, they haven't studied these bugs, and nobody except like one taxidermic study or taxonomic study in the 50s has studied them. So it was just like a really interesting, like, I'm like, how are these things right here? And they have this really unique life cycle, and they're not really being looked at. So I just wanted to, like, I mean, I'm not like a entomologist at all, I'm a visual artist, but I just wanted to like know more about them, and then like started to, you know, spend some time in the field with them. And so that's where this video came from, because I really wanted to know, I think that the piles of sand themselves are like interesting sculptural objects, and I wanted to know like how they were made. So yeah, this video is
Let's watch the
capturing.
video real quick. So there's actually two versions of this video. The one we have in the gallery has a little bit different soundscape than this one that's on your website, but that's okay. And I just wanted to say how lovely it is to have your video interplaying with Elizabeth's video, because yours is generally pretty quiet. Every once in a while you'll hear a bird or something, but what's interesting acoustically in the space is that, you know, your birds are on one side and her birds are on another, and it's very distinctive, and it creates, again, it really dimensionalizes the exhibit as a whole. So let's watch this video real quick, and then we'll talk a little bit more. So it's a pretty quiet video overall. But what I love about this piece is that we don't really get to see the beetle at all. And, you know, after reading your statement on the wall and seeing these objects that are all three in a row on a pedestal in front of this flat screen in a sort of altar kind of way. Oops. And we're looking at this video. What I love about it, you know, when we go back to the metaphor of standing at the edge of the woods and peering into, you know, the oncoming dark, there's something about this not being able to see the beetle that reminds me of that. And we're forced to use our imagination to imagine this little creature excavating a 10-foot hole into the ground. And just as I think you really capture it well in your statement, the poetry of their tireless efforts. And so this whole installation becomes less about, science so much as it becomes about poetry, and the poetry of effort, and the poetry of seeing, and the poetry of perseverance. So, and then, using our imagination with this also talks a little bit about, how so much of our knowledge of everything is built on inference and connections between things. We don't always have direct evidence for things, but we can infer. And so that's a special kind of knowledge that almost requires sometimes a little bit of faith in the system that creates the knowledge. So we trust science because it's tested over and over and over again, and old ideas are abandoned. But this piece is really interesting because here we have the scarab beetle in these sarcophagi, which are, to me, a pretty obvious connection to the Egyptian worship of, or a reverence for their scarab beetles and the mythology behind them. So tell us, there you have another project, and I'd love for people to see it on your website, the Ant Project, and tell us a little bit about that one too.
Yeah, so the sarcophagus is, like you say, the intent with that piece was thinking about scarabs metaphorically. Of course, the Egyptians were well known for, incorporating the scarab into their religious and like cultural symbolism. And the scarab in ancient Egyptian culture was like the protector that sort of took you on the path from the living world to the underworld. And so practically every mummy and sarcophagus and like every burying ritual would have the heart scarab like right here. And so I wanted to like update that for now, because now we recognize that these things are sort of in peril because of us. So I feel like instead of them protecting us now, it's like on us to decide if we want to protect them, since they've been, for thousands of years, our protectors. So like flipping the script on that a little bit, but still using the same, like I wanted them to have their own sarcophaguses, basically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a really great way to honor them, actually. Yeah, I love it.
Yeah. And then the Ant Project started when I started a lot of the work that I've done in this grad program, basically just, walking around campus, exploring the outside and finding out what else was sort of out there. And because I should mention that I'm a transplant from Maine. So one of the reasons I selected this program is because the ecology and environment is so like radically different than what I'm used to, that I was like taking it as an opportunity for like a, wiping the Etch-a-Sketch and like starting over and like learning a bunch of new things. So I happened on this harvester ant colony, which is also, there are Florida specific harvester ants, but harvester ants are like throughout the Southeast. They're really interesting because one of the things they do is they gather like bead-sized grains of quartz and they cover the top of their nest with it. And then they're sort of like, they have this like weird like OCD thing where they clear all of the vegetation in like a certain radius around their like hole. So you can spot the colonies because it will be like grass and then just like a blank, sand colored round thing with like a bunch of quartz on it. So I thought it was really cool that they were collecting all that quartz, and scientists actually still they haven't like decided why they have done that or figured that out. But so I thought I would like bring them some little sculptures that I had made and just leave them there and see if they wanted to, interact with them or whatever they would do. And then I just was like going there every day. Like one time I just like sat next to the harvester ants and like until the sun was fully down, or like different stuff like that. And then something happened where all of this, like something I was reading made me think like maybe the ants might want to know what I'm reading. So then I started like reading this poetry to them, and then making videos of that. But at first the videos were like me and the ants together, but then that's like, I felt like still too anthropocentric of a viewpoint. So I got really interested in making videos where the ants were like the main subject and not like, you know, I was just like there as a voice. So then I read this entire, I solicited text to read to them, and I read the book Annihilation by Jeff Vandermeer, which is like sci-fi eco horror set in Florida, basically. And I found I cold read it to them. I hadn't read it before, and I found there was a lot of parallels in the stuff that he talks about that, you know, was sort of relevant to what I was trying to do with the ants. But yeah.
Yeah, really fascinating. And also, I just want to say, for me, it's I enjoy the humility in these projects where, you know, you're taking yourself out of the equation in a way, and being really cognizant about your position and your relationship to the animals and to the land. So I really like that sensitivity in your work.
I think I've, you know, like in thinking about this kind of thing, it's really hard to, when you're an individual artist making art, to like take yourself out of the art. Like that's, I think, probably impossible. And so I think what I've figured out is the better strategy is to sort of like, in the process of decentering myself, but mostly focus on elevating the natural processes, or, you know, other entities that are there to the same level, that rather than like, you know, sort of like rebalancing, but thinking about things more horizontally.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Perfect. Has anything good come out for you this year? Are you looking forward to anything? And
yeah, well, I think the same. The biggest thing is sort of what like Julia talked about with you know, things being opened up internationally because of the new everyone's now using online platforms. I went to or virtually attended in the spring this thing put on by Foresta Collective out of Germany, and it was amazing. And they, you know, they were saying like while we were doing it, they're like, we were gonna have this locally and we couldn't, and then now we get to have all these attendees from all over the world. So that's like a, you know, an obvious one, but yeah, that part was amazing. I think another thing that the pandemic did for my work was last year around this time, I was working a lot with virtual reality stuff, and what attracted me to it was the ability to like, you know, send it out to anyone that had a headset and like translate like my experience or whatever I wanted like directly to them, or some simulacra of it or whatever. But then with the pandemic, it's like, okay, well, all of these things I've been saying about this, that technology can supposedly do, are like, it's on the line, like it's time to like prove it. But then it kind of didn't really work out the way that I thought. Like, you know, it's like all of a sudden it's evident how much connection is actually not there on the internet. So yeah, so it caused kind of a shift in the way that I thought about the way that I think about my work and the way that I think about what technology can do.
That's a really important, yeah, that's a really important recognition, you know, that as powerful as technology can be, you know, we've experienced that here. We opened our doors, we closed for a while and we opened June 1st. And when people started coming back in, it was like, you know, that they'd been gone for 1,000 years and they were so happy to be back, you know, and just the person-to-person interaction was so important. Yeah, that's a really important thing that you learned. Yeah. Well, thanks a lot, Luke. Good luck with your upcoming year.
Thanks. Yeah, this is the last one at USF, so thesis in spring.
Okay, all right. Yeah. Excellent. Good luck with that.
Thanks.
Elsa, are you with us?
Yep.
Good morning.
Hello.
Elsa is joining us from Chicago, where she works and lives and was born and raised. Elsa, we met in Miami last year through a mutual friend, Michelle Ruiz.
That's right.
And I remember before you came, she mentioned that you might be coming, so I looked up your website and was really blown away by your work. And I'm a big fan.
Thank you so much.
I could tell there was something much more to it than the landscape element that you're using to transmit your concepts and feelings.
For sure.
So I just want to mention, you know, like I said, you're born and raised in Chicago. You got your BFA at the American Academy of Art. You've had a number of solo shows, including the National Museum of Mexican Art in 2011. And just last year, you were awarded the Helen and Tim Meyer Foundation for the Arts Achievement Award. So congratulations on that award.
Thank you.
Be amazing. Let's get into your work here. There's a lot to talk about in your work. Could you give us a little bit of background in terms of your art and what informs your artwork?
Sure. Well, that's a big question, but first I want to make it a point to say, like, thank you so much for putting this together. And I've been so inspired hearing everyone's inspirations and everyone's vulnerability. Like, it's really appreciated. It's really nice to hear artists kind of talk from the heart. So just wanted to start there. So Nathan, do we want to get into desahogamiento right off the top? Or what you have in mind?
Yeah, I think we should probably just jump right in, because that's a pretty big concept. But what I find really interesting about this is how personal it is for you. So we're gonna start with these paintings, and just to give everyone background, all of Elsa's paintings are 8 by 8 inches, so they're quite small, but they offer these sort of points of poetry in a way, a point of rest. In contemplation as you move through the space. So let's talk about this term, and I'll let you pronounce it because you do it so beautifully.
Yes. All right. So it's a Spanish word, desahogamiento. The root word being ahogar, which means to drown. So desahogamiento means to undrown, or the process of undrowning. So I'll start by saying that my introduction to this term was hearing it from my mom. My mom's just a person who's been through a lot of trauma. And you know how typically when people go through a lot of trauma in their lives, they go one of two ways. Like either they go really cold and unable to face, to express, and they detach. Yes. Or thankfully, in the case of my mom, she just she leaned into empathy. And so I just remember myself being a very sensitive child who cried easily and often, and I was just kind of heartbroken all the time about all kinds of things. And instead of my mom saying, you know, like, you're too sensitive, you know, stop crying, like, it was never that. Her response was always desahógate, undrown yourself, right? And so that idea, like, feel everything, get everything out, you know, like I just kind of carried that with me. But it wasn't until about 2 years ago, I was reading a book by a curandera. So a curandera is a Mexican folk healer. The book is called Woman Who Glows in the Dark. And in this book, the curandera describes that there are 7 types of curanderos, one of which is called a consejera or a consejero. So that translates literally to a counselor. But the difference being that in the traditional Western counseling versus folk medicine counseling, the idea that a folk medicine healer leads with is that the medicine is allowing you to talk until there is nothing left to express. And they are, they lean into responding in any way that is necessary. Like sometimes a hug is necessary, right? Like it's not that cold kind of, you know, I'm sitting 4 feet away from my counselor and they're just writing down notes, right? It's like a loving exchange where someone is listening deeply and bearing witness to your story. So what is beautiful about this concept is that, so that is a traditional way of experiencing desahogamiento, right? Is with a deep listener. But desahogamiento can also happen in any somatic way that moves that energy through your body. So for some of us, that could be dance, that could be singing, that could be running. So I've come to the conclusion that for me, it's absolutely painting. Like I know that I need to get certain things off my chest that can only happen through painting. So yeah, like I've kind of centered my artist statement around this term. I just feel like what I'm trying to do in every body of work is desahogamiento.
Yeah, that's I love that idea of undrowning. And for a moment when I was first reading this, I asked myself, well, what's the difference between undrowning and learning to swim? Right? And there is a difference between the two.
Yes.
I can't explain it, but it's in my brain that they're different. So it's a really beautiful.
If I can add to that, the idea of undrowning is like the idea that the water, the sea is already inside of us, right? So we're trying to get the sea outside.
So you've talked a lot about so far. You've talked a lot about this personal or individual grief work or healing, and how you've how your painting helps you with that work. And then I think let's switch over to your controlled burn series, which for me, I want to frame this conversation in the healing, societal healing. And for me, the controlled burn, the metaphor applies individually, but also society, to a wider society. The metaphor of understanding how we might heal, our forests together. And, controlled burn, I think a lot of people from Florida already know what controlled burning is. People from certain other states would know that too. And, but it's a great metaphor for the fire within, or the idea of clearing the rubbish or what have you. So maybe we can talk a little bit about how controlled burn as a metaphor holds promise for health and abundance if we can just keep the fire line. So I fought fires one time when I worked on a ranch, and it was very important to keep the line, or to keep the flame alive at the same time. So go ahead and please talk about controlled burn. And
yeah, so this series started 10 years ago, actually. And in my head, it actually started when I was around 8 years old. My very first experience of seeing a forest, period, was when I was 8, and we were taken on a field trip to see the after effects of a controlled burn. And it was startling, right? Like I'm coming from this inner city neighborhood in Chicago, on the south side of Chicago. And I go to see nature for the first time, and it's ash on the floor, right? And so at that time, I found a lot of comfort in being introduced to the metaphor of a fire being necessary for health. It was a symbol of resilience. And it became a metaphor that I needed. Like I needed that metaphor as a child growing up in the particular circumstances that I was growing up in. And so, you know, fast forward all these years later, and now we're having these conversations, right, about ecology and our climate crisis. And it becomes apparent now that like my personal metaphor is resonating on a level that I didn't anticipate necessarily.
Yeah.
But yeah, it becomes, you know, indigenous people refer to controlled fire as good fire. So good fire as opposed to like the wildfires, right, that are out of control. So really controlled burning becomes it's indigenous preventative medicine. And yeah, I just think that's such a powerful distinction to remember that fire is, it obviously can be destructive, but there's a vital place for its need in our ecology, in our health.
Yeah, yeah. And you mentioned something else in your statement about the importance of intuitive ways of knowing. And I think we touched on it earlier with Julia too, about there being alternative ways of understanding. And, you know, just having a pulse in the art community and this idea or this notion or this desire is really strong right now. Like, you know, when you don't know what's going to happen, that's sort of what you have to rely on, is your instinct or intuition, combined with previous knowledge, of course. But, you know, keeping that passion alive for what you do in the creative, you know, industry, you know, for painting or sculpture or video or what, you know, what all of you are making, you know, keeping that passion alive during this time for me has been pretty difficult. Not that I'm going to quit or anything like that, but, you know, it's just a lot of questioning and a lot of doubt and a lot of, well, some of it wasn't, you know, was forced upon us. So, but a lot of good has come out of it too, with new understanding and space. So I think some of us have, and new opportunities as well have opened up, new audience. So in a funny way, this metaphor of the controlled burn is very apt for now, where, you know, it's been a wildfire, but I think we're able to manage, starting to learn how to manage this somehow, and move forward. So with that said, what's been good for you during this whole time?
Yeah, I mean, to be perfectly honest, I've been interested in, you know, for as long as I can remember, seeing artwork by people of color, right? BIPOC folk. We've always kind of been almost forced to address identity politics through the lens of trauma. And I have always been interested in healing. Like, just, you know, before I could articulate what my stance, you know, like what my particular lens was, I just knew, I'm like, you know, a traumatized community knows their trauma. They don't necessarily want to be reminded. They don't want to necessarily put it on display. And we deserve beauty. We deserve spaces of rest. And that's always kind of been my lens. And now I just feel like this collective moment where everyone's talking about grief and healing and in the collective zeitgeist, I'm like, I was made for this moment. Like, I've been ready for this. So yeah, like that's what's come out of it. I'm like, oh, here are my people. Yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
I love that. Well, thank you so much, Elsa.
Thank
really
you.
Enjoyed having your work here, and I've enjoyed working with you and knowing you, getting to know you better. So
likewise, thank you.
Thanks a lot. I want everyone who's listening and available and close to Dunedin, Florida, to feel like they can come in and see these beautiful shows.